All right, super excited to have Harleen Kaur, the founder of Ground News, back, and my producer also expressing her excitement in the background, as you can tell. All right, so Harleen, I wanted to get you back on the channel to talk about Ground News because Trump was recently suspended from Facebook and Instagram for 2 more years. And besides the news itself being big, I thought this was a really great opportunity to talk about how different outlets with their bias cover issues of free speech. Or I don't know what the other, like the people you were saying, you were telling me earlier before we started recording that the right leaning outlets are focusing more on the free speech side of it. The left leaning outlets are focusing a little bit more on, well, the danger that could be spread from it. And so since I do a lot of censorship type topics on this, being somebody from mainstream news, I thought this would be a great opportunity to really see clearly that argument and how it leaks into even sort of, the news coverage, which isn't necessarily supposed to have bias if we talk about journalism, in the overt sense, I think that it is now, but you could see it pretty clearly in this. And so could you first tell us like what you guys saw, initially from all of this, just kind of give me the generalization, and then maybe actually, why don't you start with what Ground News is? Let's start there in case people are new to it, then take us into what you guys found with this particular story.
Sure. Firstly, Allison, thanks for having me speaking with you. It's always a pleasure. So Ground News is what we call the world's first news comparison website. We'll take a single piece of news and we'll show all the different news outlets that are covering it, especially when there is a big difference how the news is being covered. So we can show it to our readers how a single piece of news can be exaggerated or equivocated. And what the problem we are trying to solve is if you read a single news source or one set of news sources, you fall into this filter bubble or echo chamber that you would think that a single piece of news is single faceted. And in Ground News, we try to expose our viewers to many different aspects of what a single issue or a single news can be, without the readers doing much of the heavy lifting. So so this story is very, very interesting, as you mentioned, because it is being perceived and covered very differently by the left and right. So we were reading as the different articles started coming out, and now if you see on the website, I think there are 226 news sources or something that are already covering it, and from very, very different arguments. And as a Ground News reader, and this is a common side effect, what it does is it makes you familiar with the arguments from different sides. So let me talk you through the left versus right, what the main difference is in terms of the argument. So when you take the emotion out of it, so if it doesn't matter personally how you feel about President Trump, if it's right or good, or if you think he's good or evil, it boils down to the principle of offense versus harm. So if what is being said is just offensive, it is free speech. And of course, it's a right under the First Amendment to express opinions, what you say. And there's a lot of good that comes from free speech. And most of us would agree that it's a core necessary piece of democracy. And free speech is an American right, and more broadly, it's a human right until someone, and this is the important bit, until it starts impinging on somebody else's right. So you don't have a right that supersedes other people's rights. So the harm principle is that you cannot say what will harm other people. So let me give you some everyday examples of that. So say you start yelling fire in a crowded mall, or you start saying duck down when you're in a plane. It's free speech. You are saying what you want to say, but by saying what you want to say, you can possibly physically harm people, and people go to jail for that. If you remember a recent case, for example, Michelle Carter case from a couple of years ago, this was this teenage girl who bullied her boyfriend over text and call, and told him to kill himself, and he did, unfortunately, and she went to jail for it. So again, was she exercising her First Amendment right of free speech? She was just saying what she wants to, but the result of that was somebody harming themselves. So does this apply to President Trump, and do social media companies have the responsibility to stop that? And that's what the argument boils down to, and that's how the coverage, if you see across the spectrum, is really, really varied. And the other strange, complicated thing about this is that does Trump's speech even if it doesn't cross the line from offense to harm, just has so much weight that it becomes harmful that when his supporters take action. So even if he's not inciting violence, can he be held accountable for inciting violence because people are liable to interpret it in a different way? So it's super complex issue, and again, as you keep seeing that it's being covered, harm versus offense throughout the spread. So for a lot of people, jury's still out. Is what President Trump did is harmful or not? But we have heard from Facebook and Twitter who have reached their decision and banned him. But one more angle, which just comes to my mind worth talking about, is that on one hand, Twitter said last week that its platform is a human right, and everyone has the access to should have the ability to access to it, in the same way that every human has the right to food or water and shelter. And on the other hand, it permanently bans President Trump, who until recently was Commander-in-Chief of the United States. So the idea of a tech company taking away human rights of the most powerful, democratically elected person on the planet doesn't sit right with a lot of people. And that's why the right is very outraged by this idea. So an example would be McDonald's or Taco Bell saying President Biden can't have food any longer. It's obviously very hilarious, but it's hilarious because McDonald's and Taco Bell are not a monopoly or duopoly on food. But in this case, Facebook and Twitter have a duopoly on social media. There are alternatives like Parler and a few other sites, but they literally hold a big chunk of world's population, and that's why their power is something that needs to be taken very seriously. And interestingly enough, someone like Bernie Sanders or Angela Merkel, who have both been critics of President Trump, have come out and said and spoken against this ban. So again, very much to the effect of free speech. So a very multifaceted problem. And what we're trying to do at Ground News is just trying to expose so you can wrap your head around this very complex issue and see the coverage just spread across the spectrum.
So quick question on clarification, and just a side note, I do actually believe, even though I'm a free speech advocate, if Taco Bell and McDonald's ban you, you should be grateful, okay? Because you'll live a lot longer to read more biased news. But with this, when it comes to like the argument for, like you said, more right-leaning outlets are focused on the precedent or the free speech side of it, the right, the human right, or the left-leaning outlet is talking about the harm and the supporters, what they could do. And is the bias in the coverage is it the way that the statements are written? Is it the questions that are posed? Is it the focus? Like, how does Ground News say, okay, this outlet is right-leaning and this is and this is focusing more on the free speech? Is it looking at the word choices? I'm just curious how that is aggregated.
Sure. So so by the way, our bias of a news outlet at this point in time is based on an outlet, not a story by story basis, because we need to have a scale to be able to represent where does CNN stand versus, for example, Sputnik or Russia Today, where do they stand on the spectrum. But then what we do is we will take all these different headlines and different articles and then compare and choose the ones that have the most drastic narrative against each other. And so that the users can highlight and see, if you just scroll down and see how the different headlines have changed from something like Trump is enraged from this comment to this is a big outcry and against human rights. If you just scroll down and just read that. So it's what I want to say to your viewers is that it's not so much not to get hung so much upon the label of the news outlet, but trying to see what exactly they are saying about the issues. And that's why we want people to have this free thinking. All we are providing is this allocation of different viewpoints to you. And we want to stop there and not say, hey, what Right is saying is wrong or what the left is saying is wrong. It's very much up to the reader to add that critical thinking and arrive to their conclusion.
And I'm guessing, part of the point of that is, hey, you could be reading an outlet that lines up, I'm going to show your graph again. Here you have the far left, lean left, center, lean right, far right. Now, if you say 40% of the coverage was left leaning, 33% center, 27% right. Actually, that makes me think of another question, but just to stay on point here. Is it that you're thinking, okay, say I pick one from this column here, I may not be introduced to the thoughts put into this column here.
Exactly.
So I've never.
That's exactly it.
Okay.
Because the points of, again, the labeling and bucket is not so much, again, to get hung up. Why is this only right versus why is this far right? The point is that they are going to have similar talking points if they belong to a single bucket. And if you were a reader that normally, if you don't come to ground news or don't do this yourself, you're welcome to do this yourself, is if you only kind of be in that bubble or that set of news sources, then you'll never be exposed to this other argument. And that holds true for both left and right. Both of them are just as guilty in terms of equivocating or exaggerating arguments to fit their narrative.
Okay, one last final question. This is actually generally not just for this particular story, but do you find that there are more of a certain a certain leaning outlet? Like, in other words, my read is that my old industry, the majority lean left. I don't know if that means my producer agrees or disagrees, not sure. In the amount of news sources you guys have aggregated, is there a majoritarian side of things? Like, are there more outlets, because I'm curious, because it's like you might have 27% lean a certain way, lean right, but is that just because there are fewer of those outlets? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a very good point. So look, the mainstream media that in US is on an average leans left. That's where they stand. So in terms of circulation, in terms of their readership, so if you add up something like CNN plus Washington Post plus New York Times, so you are going to cover. But in the total number of outlets, no, there is a lot of right-leaning outlets. And if anything, if I were to compare far left versus far right, there's a lot more far right articles than or publications than they are far left publications, which is very interesting. And the mainstream, yes, there is lesser of a right-leaning media. So, for example, News Corp owns a big majority of mainstream right-leaning media with Fox News or New York Post or Fox Business and Wall Street Journal. So it's interesting. They end up sounding kind of flavors of the same news, again, talking from the same viewpoints. But yeah, there is diversity of thought. It's just in terms of leadership, the left leaning seems to have a bit more majority, and that's why we don't give any weighted average of what is the readership of that single outlet. We just count them as an outlet, regardless of how popular they are and how many people read them, and just count them as one vote in terms of opinion, and that's where you get the percentages. And percentages in this case is not that interesting. Where it becomes interesting is when what we call is a blind spot, where there's no coverage at all by an issue by a left or right. And we do a weekly newsletter. We have a feed on our website where you see these blind spots every single day. So if you were just reading right-leaning media or just reading left-leaning media, you would have totally missed out a story. And that, I think, is where the bias distribution is more important, where you can literally understand what if we are mapping the talking points of left-leaning media versus right-leaning media, that they just won't simply talk about certain issues. Some obvious ones are, for example, climate change, very little coverage on right, and often tends to be a blind spot on the right. Or whereas the left, if there is immigrant crime, if there happens to be very little coverage of that. So yeah, both of them are equally responsible for not covering certain pieces of news, and that's where bias distribution is interesting to watch.
All right, Harleen Kaur, thank you so much for everything. And everybody, check out the links in the description so you can go check out Ground News and become a more well-rounded consumer of news. Harleen, anything else you want to add before we go?
No, thank you so much, Allison. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And yeah, feedback welcome from your viewers. They're obviously a very smart bunch of people. So we are always looking for how we can improve ourselves. Thanks, Allison.
Thank you. Take care. And of course, everybody, remember when you're looking at the links in the description, check out the other platforms I'm on besides Ground News, because Ground News doesn't censor, right, Harleen? But YouTube does. So anyway, saying wrap it up. Check out all the links in the description. We'll see you guys next time. Bye, Harleen. See ya.
Later.